There are people like that, and I do in my clinical practice about 50% of my times with addiction medicine, and I think there are addiction pathways here.
Mm.
Bread is a particularly bad one, sugar, also refined carbs in general. I think there are addiction issues, and people that the story you just told is a classic addiction, remission, relapse kind of a situation.
You've just heard Dr. Jay Wortman, who is Clinical Assistant Professor in the Faculty of Medicine at the University of British Columbia. He's also held senior management positions in Health Canada, and he's currently a practicing physician in Vancouver. We cover many topics in this podcast, one of which is how Jay reversed or put into remission his type 2 diabetes within a matter of weeks. And he did this by working some things out from first principles. So I hope you enjoy that and all the other topics we cover in this podcast. Welcome to the Fat Emperor podcast. I'm your host, Ivor Cummins. We're supported by the Irish Heart Disease Awareness Charity, which advocates a simple CT scan to reveal your CAC score. So know your score and take action to prevent that premature heart attack. Everything you need to know will be right here. Well, I'm here with Jay Wortman, Dr. Jay Wortman, who is one of the early adopters of low carb for resolving modern chronic diseases. So delighted to meet you, Jay, here in Ireland.
Pleasure is all mine.
Yeah, and in fairness, you're probably suffering from a bit of jet lag. You only came over from Canada a couple of days back.
That's right. I'm still totally messed up.
Well, you're in the right place in that case. You're in my home.
Good.
Hey, I'd love to have a chat with you about several things, but one of them is an incredible story, as far as I'm concerned, about how you discovered that you had type 2 diabetes, the steps you took in the short term to deal with this kind of shocking discovery, and the insights you got from that very early on.
Well, it was 16 years ago now when I discovered that I had type 2 diabetes. I'd been working in a position with Health Canada. I had a senior management job with Health Canada, so I wasn't doing clinical practice at the time. And I was not well. I had gained weight, I was fatigued, I would have afternoon crashes where I could barely keep awake at my desk, and things like typical diabetes symptoms in retrospect. But I noticed that I had to squint at the TV in the evening, and I was drinking more. I was getting up at night to go to the bathroom, and I just thought these were the inevitable effects of getting older. Until one day it occurred to me that I had the whole florid symptomology of type 2 diabetes, which shouldn't have been a surprise because I have a strong family history of diabetes on my mother's side of the family. But nonetheless, when I figured it out, it was a bit of a shock. And largely because at the time my son was 2 years old, and I know too much, as a doctor, this is, your life expectancy is suddenly shorter. You're at risk for all these complications and cardiovascular disease, myocardial infarction, stroke, all these, significant potential life-shortening problems. And so it was a bit of a shock in that sense. And, the last thing that would have occurred to me to do is go see a doctor, right? So my plan, and this happened, on a dark and rainy November day in my, lovely house in West Vancouver. I'm upstairs in the bathroom looking in the mirror thinking, you don't look well, and I think you might have diabetes. And in the bathroom cabinet, I actually had some test strips, urine test strips, and I peed on the test strip and it went as dark as it could be. And it
Wow.
was like, yeah, it's like boom.
And you might have been up at 8 or 9 millimolar.
Oh, yeah, it was off the chart. And so my immediate thought was, I need to figure out what the best drug is. And I'm a little out of date because I haven't been working in the clinical practice for a while. So what I'll do in the interim is I'll just minimize my blood sugar by avoiding carbohydrates. Because, having been a well-trained doctor, I knew that carbohydrates made your blood sugar go up, right? But it had never occurred to me And I'd never encountered it in my training or my prior practice that you might do that to manage your diabetes, right? it was it was like contrary to the conventional thinking where you've got this tremendous intolerance of carbohydrates, but here, keep eating them and we'll give you some drugs or insulin or everything to try and make it okay. That was the conventional approach and still is the conventional approach.
And it is extraordinary actually that
Hmm.
that is the case, because if something that's completely obvious
Yeah,
that you have a problem metabolizing
yeah.
carbohydrate, therefore you should go lower, it's so obvious you'd want absolutely compelling data to say why that's counterintuitive and no, we should do the opposite, which of course doesn't really exist.
No, and now looking back, it's just so strikingly clear that when you have an intolerance to carbohydrates, you shouldn't eat carbohydrates. I mean, what is so problematic about that? Yet we're still banging our head against the conventional approach to the management of diabetes. So anyway, for me at the time, it was completely serendipitous because my plan was I'll just minimize the harm of high glycemic numbers while I figure out what the best drug is. But what happened was, well, I did. I completely stopped eating carbohydrates. And within a few days, literally, all those symptoms reversed. You know, everything got better. And I started losing weight at a, literally a pound a day. The weight just fell off me over the course of the next month. Now, my wife's a worrier, and I didn't want to cause her any distress with this newfound problem. So I didn't mention to her I had diabetes, but she noticed I wasn't eating any carbohydrates. So within a few days, I had to tell her what was going on. And she said, "You're on the Atkins diet, dummy, you know." And at that point, I had the conventional medical training, which is virtually zero nutritional training. And I really didn't at that point really understand the Atkins diet.
So
Yeah.
you were really simply eliminating most, if not all,
Yeah.
carbohydrates
Hmm.
without thinking what kind of diet that
No,
left you on.
no. And so she had brought home an Atkins book after our son was born and, to shed her post baby weight. And I had, brushed it off the way I had been trained to do. Yeah, nobody can stay on those diets. Yeah, whatever. So she brought the book out and dusted it off. And I read the Atkins book and I thought, yeah, that's what I'm doing. I'm doing that. And then I got very intrigued because of the results. I mean, my blood sugars went back to normal. I lost the weight. I felt better. My energy level went up. I had steady energy all day. I didn't have an afternoon crash anymore. My mood improved. My ability to cope with stress improved. So many things got better that I became really intrigued with why in my entire training and practice did I never encounter this before? Why was this never suggested by anyone as a way to deal with diabetes? You
Yeah,
know?
and I guess we probably understand a little better now that the whole low fat and fear of
Yeah.
fat
Hmm.
kind of spawned
Yeah.
a carb is good environment for decades.
Yes.
And
Hmm.
to do what you describe is to
Hmm.
go diametrically opposed to all of the dietary advice in the
Hmm.
world.
Yes. Exactly. And I had no concept of how dogmatic and entrenched that was. But what happened was I was working in First Nations and Inuit health for government, Canadian government, where we have this tremendous, tragic epidemic of diabetes. I mean, it's just devastating these communities. And it started to occur to me that this is the reason why, because here I am dealing with people who, within living memory, ate a traditional diet that was very low in carbohydrates, certainly no sugar, extremely minimal amounts of sugar in the form of berries in a seasonal way, and no starch, no refined starches, diet of meat and fats from the land. And within a couple of generations, have adopted the worst forms of diet, the worst junk foods that you can imagine, and they're suffering this crushing epidemic of diabetes. So I started connecting those dots, and I was working in that field, and I would have opportunity to speak to audiences, about this. And I started to speak out very naively, thinking, I've stumbled on the answer here. Look what happened to me, and this can happen to you. And the dietitians used to line up at the microphones to tear a strip off me. Like, what in the world are you talking about? This is crazy. This is madness. So I started to get a sense that this wasn't just a simple situation where you stumble on a brilliant idea and it gets adopted. It was quite the opposite.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But understandable in retrospect that that's an enormous
Mm.
threat to their whole existence as a profession in some ways, because to
Yep.
be shown to be wrong on the approach for one of the biggest diseases in the world and to have been wrong for decades, it's hard to know how to recover your professional pride, your professional reputation. So I guess it's not so much a conspiracy of silence so much as they probably can't believe themselves that they're wrong. There must be a self delusion of sorts at play,
Well,
maybe.
you've probably heard doctors tell you before that when we go through our medical training, we're told half of what you've been taught will turn out to be wrong, meaning that throughout your professional career, you have to stay abreast of developing science and adjust your practice accordingly. My impression of the nutritional sciences is that when they graduate, they're handed a set of stone tablets and told never ever deviate from this, for the rest of your career. Because I find it that, and I'm being unfair to a lot of, nutritionists and dietitians who do practice in this space. But my general impression of that profession is that they're very dogmatic and rigid, and not open to ideas like this. Yeah.
Yeah, and I certainly agree, Jay. But I will have to say that there are an increasing numbers, and you probably
There are.
mentioned there,
Yeah.
who are slowly breaking
Hmm.
out. And it must be like, I don't know, it must be like seeing a sunrise for the first
Yes.
time. And I
Hmm.
guess as they begin to open their minds to the possibility that this obvious
Yeah.
logic is
Yeah.
indeed obviously correct,
Hmm.
I'd say pretty quickly they flip over. But the
And
ones with closed minds hold tight to the last moment.
I really admire the ones that break ranks, because I think it must be very difficult in those professions to break ranks. I think the consequences can be severe for people there, and we've seen that in certain cases, high profile cases now.
Yeah,
Yeah.
for
Hmm.
sure. So when you went ahead and you basically found the short-term solution to your
Hmm.
diabetes,
Yeah.
theoretically your blood sugars now, if you are measured, are not technically diabetic.
No. Yeah.
No. So I know there's a lot of controversy, and with Virta Health getting great results and
Hmm.
so many other teams,
Hmm. Hmm.
diabetes.co.uk, we're seeing a huge amount of mitigation,
Yeah.
getting off drugs. But the words reversal, remission,
Yeah.
there's some controversy around the words. I have my own thoughts on it, but how do you
Yeah.
feel around that?
Well, people would talk, use comments like, is this the cure? And I don't see it that way. The way I look at it and the way I talk to my patients about it is, I have developed a food intolerance. I have an intolerance to carbohydrates. The diagnosis of a food intolerance, that's one of the lectures I didn't sleep through in med school. I remember vividly being taught, this is how you diagnose a food intolerance. You give the food to someone, bad things happen. You take the food away, those things correct, you've got a food intolerance. And that's how I look at carbohydrates when you have insulin resistance. So whether you're diabetic, pre-diabetic, or pre-pre-diabetic, if you're developing insulin resistance, you are developing an intolerance to carbohydrates. So I have a food intolerance. If I avoid the foods that are the offending foods, I'm fine. If I eat those foods, I pay a price.
And if we extend that analogy then, or kind of principle, the latest CDC figures for the US, 64% of adults over 45 years of age are pre diabetic or diabetic, which I know is an arbitrary
Yeah,
cutoff. So nearly two-thirds of the adult population of that age and above are essentially, by definition, intolerant to carbohydrate.
yeah.
But that would mean, shock horror, that a lower carbohydrate diet is the more default diet for the modern Western population, would you
Yeah,
say?
yeah, yeah. And the whole concept of government food guides is that this is for the general population, not people who are metabolically damaged or unwell. Well, when the majority of the population is metabolically damaged, how do you justify a food guide that doesn't account for that? And so you're seeing in the States now significant challenges to the food guide process. Same in Canada. And they're really dug in. I mean, they're very rigidly dug in on the conventional thinking still.
Yeah, but again,
Hmm.
it's the thing that it's unthinkable. You can't move forward and change without de facto saying you were wrong
Yes.
before, and this is
Mm-hmm.
a really trenchant problem. And on the reversal, yeah, cure is a dangerous
Mm-hmm.
word. I hear a lot of arguments about this
Mm-hmm.
online. I'm in some of them. I mean, I love fighting, but
Mm-hmm.
the cure remission, I think for some people, the diabetes is almost cured, or it's in deep remission, and they can even later play a little with
Mm-hmm.
carbohydrate without
Yeah.
detrimental effects.
Mm-hmm.
Some people then got to stay hardcore low carb. There's
Mm-hmm.
no messing around.
Yeah.
And I liken it in a way to the liver enzyme GGT for
Mm-hmm.
alcoholics. If
Mm-hmm.
you're an alcoholic, the GGT is high.
Yeah.
And if you're not, the GGT might be low, say 15, and the alcoholic's at 100.
Mm-hmm.
There's a fascinating phenomenon that ex-alcoholics who have been on the drive for years, their GGT comes down to say 25.
Mm-hmm.
If they have a lot of drink over a couple of days, the GGT will fly back up.
Yeah.
The
Mm-hmm.
non-alcoholic drinking the same amount of alcohol for a few days, the GGT will barely creep up.
Yeah.
So they have a molecular memory, a damage to the machine, that once you take away the intolerance, or
Mm-hmm.
what's causing the intolerance, the problem, you can't really add it back in later. You're
Mm-hmm.
not as cured as someone who never had the problem in the first place.
Yeah. And that's how I look at it as well, because the way I would describe myself is I've damaged my metabolic machinery. And I can manage that by avoiding the foods that cause that damage, but I can't reverse it. I can't eat carbohydrates at will now. I find, and I notice it. If I do, encounter some carbohydrates, I don't feel very well. I notice it right away.
Yeah.
So, hmm.
And people on a low carb diet, it's kind of
Hmm.
known once you take the pressure off your insulin system,
Hmm.
if you suddenly drop some carb in, often the blood glucose can spike quite a lot with the
Yeah,
insulin being low.
yeah.
So
Hmm.
best to
Yeah.
stick to your knitting.
And
Mm.
that's how it developed for me over the early years. Is my carb content of my diet went lower and lower and lower because I noticed that if I ate a little bit of carb, it was not, I didn't feel well. So I just trended down and down and down, and I stay quite low. And we're 16 years out now, and I have very good lipid markers. I have normal blood sugars, normal hemoglobin A1C, normal blood pressure. My blood pressure had been high in the past. And I've sustained a weight loss of in the range of 30, 35 pounds over that period of time. So I get little impatient with people who say, yeah, that diet's good in the short term, but nobody can stick to it. I don't think I'm a Superman. I think I'm just an ordinary person with no you know, great willpower better than anyone else, and I can stick to it. And I think the reason I can stick to it is I think it's the diet that, I don't want to get into the whole paleo discussion, but I think it's the diet humans evolved on. It's closer to that diet than the one that's promoted by the food guides that's full of all kinds of starches and sugars and refined foods.
Yeah, and I'd agree. But also, I mean, deeply understanding, as you would have, the sense it made to be lower carb,
Hmm.
uh, would also help. I often wonder about this, that if people are told, well, low carb is good for you, and they're given a recipe book, can they really be very successful as a population going forward, or will they slip? And I think, or I've often thought this, that by really understanding what the food does when it goes into your body and knowing all the principles and scientific principles involved, or at least having a good grasp of them, it helps you stay on a healthy low carb diet.
Hmm.
Whereas someone who's just handed a recipe book within 6 or 12 months, I think the potential to drift is pretty large. And then you create all of these uh, non-successes or pseudo failures. So how much do you think really understanding it and believing in it, has to do with your success?
I think you have to give people a conceptual model, something that makes sense to them about why they're doing this. So that's why I usually do talk to them about a food intolerance. Most people understand lactose intolerance, you know,
Yeah.
and how do you deal with that? Well, you just avoid the offending food. Well, you've developed an insulin intolerance, or sorry, a carbohydrate intolerance. And here's why. I can show them on their blood markers. Your hemoglobin A1C has crept up over 6. Your triglyceride HDL ratio is a little high, and these sorts of things. Your CRP is creeping up. These are signs of a carbohydrate intolerance. And these things can be reversed by avoiding carbohydrates. And they come back a couple months later. Well, I'll see them more often, but within a couple months, we'll redo the test, and I'll say, look, your triglycerides have come down, your HDL's gone up, your hemoglobin A1C's come down. This confirms that by avoiding carbs, you're managing your intolerance.
Yeah, so that does give them a very simple kind of
Yeah.
rule of thumb
Mm-hmm.
and a simple way to understand it,
Yep.
even though there's more complexity under the hood.
Exactly.
And what about people who, I guess you'd have people as well that maybe their LDL bad cholesterol might go up a little, or
Yeah.
some of the markers
Yeah.
don't look so perfect?
Well, everybody's worried about LDL, right? That's where all the money is, too, right? When in fact, if you look at the lipid panel, the HDL and triglyceride are better predictors of cardiometabolic risk. And the most predictive number is actually the triglyceride HDL ratio. In Canada, where I practice, we don't have access to NMR particle size tests for LDL, but we do understand that you want large particle LDL, that the small atherogenic particles are the ones that are the problem. And we don't have a scan test that'll differentiate for us. However, when you look at the triglyceride HDL ratio, you can infer what the LDL particle size is. So I'll often get my patients back and they'll be concerned because the LDL has gone up, when in fact their triglyceride HDL ratio has become very favorable. In Canada, the cutoff mark I use is under 0.76. And if people are under 0.76, then we're confident that their LDL particle size is large, the healthy LDL particle size. And when I take a couple minutes to walk them through that explanation, people are comfortable with that. And we'll usually, in the context of a discussion about statins, decide not to take a statin.
Right, based on the preponderance of the data rather
Yes.
than just one marker.
Yeah.
And of course, there are so many papers now which illustrate that point that the triglyceride over the HDL is
Yeah.
far, far more powerful
Yeah.
than, say, the LDL. Have you really had people who go very high in LDL, like crazy high? Probably not on classic low carb. I think you have to go really keto maybe to get a very high response.
I haven't had nothing, none come to mind that have gone off the charts. No.
Yeah. And maybe just for people listening, yeah, that 0.76. So for American units, so maybe below 1.5 would probably be a reasonable target to have
Yeah.
the larger
Mm.
LDL size.
Mm.
It's
Yeah.
an interesting thing as well that the LDL size, there's a debate around, are the smaller particles, which are only like a few nanometers smaller,
Mm-hmm.
are they actually worse, or did they just reflect increased insulin resistance?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I guess that's one that'll keep getting argued in the coming years.
There are nuances. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
So if your bloods are good, um, that's great if they look really good. If your bloods are really terrible, you have high risk.
Mm-hmm.
But the group of people, which on average in America, maybe Canada too, that's the largest group, are middle risk people.
Mm-hmm.
And middle risk people have some markers good, some not so good. It's unclear. And I think the blood markers are very ambiguous sometimes,
Yeah.
especially for this group.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm personally, on behalf of IHDA, the charity I work for, I'm a proponent of the calcium scan,
Yes.
which is vastly more powerful than the
Mm-hmm.
blood markers in
Mm-hmm.
predicting events. But I don't think, like tragically, like elsewhere in the world, it's getting used a lot in Canada.
No, no, it isn't. And you're quite right. I mean, the blood markers are surrogate markers. I mean, based on what we understand, we can interpret those and tell our patients your risk is this or that or the other. The calcium scan actually measures what's going on in the coronary arteries. Uh, so it's brilliant in the sense that it's a direct measurement. It's not a surrogate measurement. But for some reason, it has not been embraced where I practice. I think in my patient population, I can think of maybe one or two people who've had a calcium scan, and it's because they've gone to the States where it's more readily available. It is available in Vancouver in one of the hospitals, but it has to be done through a cardiology referral. And so I can't send someone for a calcium scan. They have to go see a cardiologist, and then the cardiologist may or may not decide to send them for a calcium scan. And I don't think, as a general rule, they're using it that much. So it's a little bit of a conundrum in my mind because I do think it's a valuable test.
Yeah, and I think the US is really, as you say, collapsed in price, and
Mm,
you don't need even a doctor to refer in many
yeah,
states.
yeah.
But a cardiologist referral, that's a big deal. You have to go to cardio even.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
I do tell my patients who are interested in this to go south of the border and take a few American dollars with you, and you can get one, right?
Yeah, as low as 49, I've heard,
Is that
which
right?
is crazy.
That's
Yeah.
at Walmart, I think.
Yeah. Well, yeah, or Costco or one of
Yeah.
these American phenomenons. So actually, one other thing I wanted to talk to you about was the native peoples you mentioned earlier. I mean,
Hmm.
they have been absolutely decimated. And if we take type 2 diabetes, whether it's diagnosed or not, or pre-diabetes, as one of the primary dominant drivers of cardiovascular disease
Hmm.
and much, much else we know now, these native peoples and the Pima Indians and almost any native peoples from around the world who travel to the West and take on our diet and lifestyle, they're so grossly affected. So maybe talk about your work with those guys a bit more and what you discovered.
Yeah, it's a tragedy. It's a slow motion tragedy. And I was traveling in northern British Columbia. This is 7 or 8 years ago now, and there's an old doctor up there that worked in the First Nations communities for quite a few years. And we were having a conversation, and he said that he had arrived there 40 years earlier. And he said at that time, diabetes was rare. And he said today, virtually every adult over the age of 50 has diabetes in these communities. So something dramatic changed over that short period of time. And what I think happened, obviously it was related to diet change. The introduction of refined foods, refined starches, vegetable oils, I think, are implicated. Sugar is definitely implicated. But it makes me think about epigenetics and the multiplier effect of a generational change over 2 or 3 generations because people were getting exposed to starch as a refined flour, sugar quite a few decades ago in these communities. But the whole flood of diabetes has been in the last 4 or 5 decades. So I think it might have taken a generation or two of exposure to really unleash the harm of this diet change. So it's a remarkable, tragic thing that's going on. And seems to me so amenable to correction through a return to a traditional style of diet. So what I did, when I had my epiphany, I was at Health Canada, and I was able to convince people there that we should try an experiment like this, because in First Nations communities, the costs of this were enormous. Beyond the human tragedy, the cost to government of paying for all this care was extraordinary. So they were amenable to an idea that maybe would help in both the human aspect and the cost. So the senior guy that I worked for said, nothing we're doing now seems to be working, so why not? So yeah, I managed to get funding and to do a diet trial in a small First Nations community where we went in and we said, here's our thought. we think this problem's because of your diet change. We think your traditional diet was a healthy diet. So we would like you to return to your traditional diet or a facsimile thereof. In other words, if you can't access all the salmon and moose and deer, you can eat beef and pork and chicken. Um, as long as you're avoiding those foods that were alien to your traditional diet, in other words, refined carbohydrates, vegetable oils, sugars. So people embrace this idea. We had a lovely experience in a small First Nations community where we inducted about 100 people into a study, with uh, all kinds of typical things you do in a study with consents and informed consent and all this kind of stuff. And what we discovered in this community, it was a small island. There were about 1,800 people on the island, about half of them in the First Nations community, that there was this huge uptake. People embraced the idea. It rippled into the community. So we recruited about 100 people, but soon discovered that many more other people were trying the same thing. And we got really good results. The kind of things we understand now would have happened, did in fact happen. People lost weight, they got off their diabetes meds, their blood sugars and their lipids and all these kinds of things got better. And our national broadcaster, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, got interested in this and had a documentary film crew following us around for a year and made just a lovely documentary about this story. It's called My Big Fat Diet. And probably the only place now, I used to be able to find it on YouTube, but I don't know where it went. And Andreas Seinfeld has it on his Diet Doctor website. He bought the rights to show it. So if people want to watch it, they can join up on Andreas' site and see it there.
Yeah, I saw it myself years ago, and it
Yeah.
was excellent, Jay, to be honest. And I'd like to unpack this a little bit. What you mentioned there about the kind of transgenerational
Yeah.
multiplying effect, I find fascinating because
Mm-hmm.
it has parallels in my old world of engineering too.
Mm-hmm.
There's just this multiplier effect. So you have, if mothers become more hyperinsulinemic, more diabetic, more gestational diabetes, which is a huge prediction of future
Yes.
diabetes in the
Mm.
offspring,
Yeah.
in generation one, then generation two are born with some disadvantage
Yes.
relatively.
Yeah.
They are going to fare worse, and generation three will
Yes.
come from a second generation that has fared worse, and you are
Yes.
building up this epigenetic kind of
Yes.
rolling, kind of building snowball,
Exactly.
heading to a tsunami, which
Yep.
is what, of course, we're seeing.
Yes.
Now, I don't think anyone can really argue against that effect, and I think we talked earlier about a study, you might mention it, in mice or rats, I'm not sure, kind of demonstrating some of this.
Well, there was a recent rodent study where they fed I can't remember if it was mice or rats, but they fed them a structured diet with a fixed amount of calories, in which the fat source was canola oil. And then the subsequent generation got the exact same diet, same calories, the next subsequent generation, and so on. And each new generation had higher levels of obesity. Everything else was the same,
Including calorific content as
the same amount of
specifically.
calories,
Yeah.
but their obesogenic properties increased with each subsequent generation. So, a lovely experiment showing the epigenetic cumulative effect from one generation to another of this metabolic harm. And I think that, to my mind, explains what seems to have happened in these populations with whom I've worked in northern Canada.
And actually, there's many studies that are somewhat similar to yours. One that springs to
Mm,
mind I have in my few thousand papers. But one of them was Australia, where they went to a traditional paleo diet for the Australian
yeah.
indigenous peoples.
Hmm.
They got them out back into the outback. They gave them a lot of
Yeah.
game and
Yeah.
animals they would have
Hmm.
caught. And the change in their metabolic
Yeah.
parameters was
Hmm.
incredible. I mean,
Yeah.
hypertension
Yeah.
collapsed, and
Hmm.
all the others you mentioned.
Yeah.
So it just shows, even though there's a multi generational build up of the
Hmm.
problem, the damaged machines,
Hmm.
you can still, with an acute intervention, back off a lot of the issue. Now, I'm
Yes.
guessing backing off now a little bit on sugar and refined carb and vegetable oils, given what we just described, is not going to have a magic effect. That's why I think for people who already have damaged machines,
Hmm.
broken machines, you kind of need to go further than you might have had to go before all of this damage built up,
Yes.
right?
Hmm. Yeah, exactly. I'm familiar with the work there. That was Dr. Karen O'Day in Australia, where the Aborigine men with diabetes went back on the land and lived their traditional lifestyle, eating their traditional foods, and basically reversed their diabetes, much the same way I did. And then when they returned back to their life in the village, everything went sideways again. And the interesting thing about this is I've got to know some Aborigine people, and I've had quite good experiences with them in Australia, and I've also met Dr. Karen O'Day, who believes profoundly in the low-fat diet. And my Aborigine friends are there telling me, no, no, we eat the fat. We have a special way of cooking the kangaroo so we don't lose the kangaroo fat. And when we eat witchetty grubs, which are these larvae that are fatty. And when we kill the lizard, we cut it open. If it doesn't have a fat mass, we throw it away and we eat only the fatty ones. Whereas Dr. O'Day, even though she did this wonderful experiment, still thinks that low-fat diet is the right way to go. So
And yeah, and we do hear this. It's crazy.
she got quite upset with me for butting heads with her over that point down there.
And was she open to a cordial discussion over a drink, kind of explaining why you are?
Maybe the drink was the missing element in that discussion
Yeah.
because we did butt heads a bit on that. Yeah,
Yeah, I know there's nothing that some wine won't fix.
exactly.
But it's still, so she in a way is in a sense too, it's not her fault. She has grown up her whole career with a
Yeah,
belief system
yeah.
that
Mhm.
overturning it is just a
Mhm.
bit too hard.
Now, the interesting thing is some Canadian researchers tried to replicate that study with Cree in northern, I think it was in northern Quebec. And they took the Cree people out on the land. They were familiar with Dr. O'Day's work and thought, we'll replicate this study. The Cree went from their village and they lived out on the land, lived their traditional lifestyle, and they didn't get the same result. And the difference was that they brought their market foods with them.
Ah.
So the difference wasn't living on the land, living a traditional lifestyle, it was the diet. Yeah.
And diet is the dominant. By all means,
Hmm.
there'll be stress and sleep
Hmm.
and community and
Yeah.
all these
Hmm.
things. I have no problem
Hmm.
acknowledging their factors, but diet is where you put the biggest input into the machine is the diet, no
Yes.
question.
Yeah.
Exercise brings to mind, Jay, and
Mm.
I've heard so many arguments about, you know, that exercise or lack thereof is a big part of
Hmm.
this.
Hmm.
Now, the thing about exercise is there are many studies on the HADSTA, I think, peoples where the
Hmm.
exercise they're doing is not different on average than Westerners, and they're slim as whippets.
Yeah.
I mean, these guys are
Hmm.
lats, as we say in Ireland. We have the study with Catavans and Swedish men,
Hmm.
where the Swedish men were 8 to 9 micro units of insulin, fasting insulin, and the Catavans were 3.5. I mean, it was chalk and cheese.
Hmm.
And they looked at the Catavan activity level versus low activity, medium, and very high activity Swedish men, which
Hmm.
is higher than the Catavans.
Hmm.
But the Swedish men all had the insulin 8 or 9, and the Catavans were 3.5, and insulin, of course, being a proxy for health.
Hmm.
But I could go on and on and on. So many studies demonstrate that although exercise is good for health, no question about that, love it, it is not the primary reason why the population has gone down the toilet in the last
Yeah.
30 years, even based on American average
Hmm.
activity versus 30, 40 years ago.
Hmm.
It's a factor.
Yeah.
But what say you on that? A dominant factor above 10 or 20% of the problem? I can't see the signs.
I generally tell my patients that if you're going to launch into a low carb, high fat diet because of your metabolic problems, don't exercise. Let the diet do its work for about a month. And once you've adapted, you're fully fat adapted, and you're hopefully in ketosis part or most of the time, you're going to find your energy level goes up and you're going to feel like being more active, and then go for it. But give yourself time to adapt. I think diet, as you said, is 90% of the problem. I think exercise is good for all kinds of reasons. It's not terribly good for weight loss. And when it comes to fixing the metabolic machinery, I think strength training has an advantage over cardio. But I think a mix of strength and cardio is the way to go. And I'm always reminded, I told you about the project we did in the First Nations community. One of the people I remember from that study was this old man. He was about 72. He'd been a carpenter. He had retired. He'd become sedentary. He was diabetic, fully medicated, would sit on the sofa all day watching TV. And he was about 50 pounds overweight. And I I actually stumbled on him one day because I was riding the ferry out of the community, and we ended up sitting with each other and chatting. And I didn't even recognize him as a member of the study. But he told me the most remarkable story about how after he went on our diet, our study diet, he shed 50 pounds, got off all his medications, normalized his blood sugar, and felt so energetic that he couldn't bear to sit at home. And he went back to work as a carpenter, and he was working up on the roof. They were putting a new roof on the church. This 72-year-old guy, complete turnaround. But the striking point was that his energy level went up and he felt like exercising. That the metabolic problems exacerbated by eating the carbs killed his energy. And when you took away that noxious factor, he sprang to life. He wanted to exercise.
Yeah, exactly. And I see it as it's a kind of a death spiral.
Yeah.
Primarily and overwhelmingly, the problematic modern foods, refined carbs, sugars, and vegetable oils, and you can add some more in there. They lead you into a spiral. And I think people who become middle aged, they subconsciously they're not that conscious that they're slipping into a more hyperinsulinemic state. They're putting on weight, and by the time they really realize, shit, I got to do something about this, they're already not in a good position to take action. Now they could force themselves to go into the gym, but I like what you're saying, and that's the way it happened for me. First, by fixing the fuel going into the machine, after a few weeks, you have, it might not be more physical muscle energy bouncing out of you, though there is some of that for sure, but there's a mental wellness, a mental acuity, and a thirst for life that notably increases and makes you want to go further, makes you want to get fitter. You've seen the results, you've lost 10 or 12 pounds, you're feeling great. People are all saying, geez, what do you do, man? And you're liking it. And then you start adding in some weights maybe and do a bit of resistance. And before you know it, it's just fantastic. And then you want to tell everyone.
Yeah.
But I agree, yeah, the exercise is great for health, but it is not the primary reason or even a very dominant one of how we have ended up with the Western world destroyed.
So the hormones involved here. You get hyperinsulinemic, right? That's an early factor in this. Your triglycerides go up. Okay, both of those things are linked to the high carb, vegetable oil diet. One of the effects of that is that you block the effect of leptin. Okay, both high insulin, high triglycerides block leptin from reaching your brain. Leptin is the stop eating hormone. So leptin is generated by expanding fat tissue. So it's a classic feedback system where you're getting into an excess calorie state, you're expanding your fat, it sends a message to your brain telling you to stop eating, right? That system gets thwarted when insulin levels are high, when triglycerides are high, both of which occur when you're eating excess refined carbohydrates. When your brain doesn't get a leptin signal, it interprets that to mean that you're starving. And when you starve, and this is across all kinds of species, you do two things. You conserve energy and you seek food. So these people that get into a leptin resistant state, which is where I was and where type 2 diabetic insulin resistant people go, you have the primordial survival part of your brain telling you not to exercise and telling you to eat at every opportunity. So that's the spiral. That's the downward spiral. And the only way to break out of that is to correct the hyperinsulinemia and the high triglycerides. And how do you correct that? You stop eating carbs. And you unwind that. And suddenly that leptin starts, that appetite control modulating system dependent on leptin sensitivity springs back to life. And you stop eating to excess and you start to feel like exercising. So it, to me, makes perfect sense.
I agree entirely.
Yeah.
It makes perfect. And there's some very elegant papers on exactly what you were talking about there with the actual molecular mechanisms of where high triglyceride causes this to the receptor system.
Yeah.
So we kind of know all the science, and we know it makes sense in an engineering sense, in a kind of a microbiology sense, in every sense, and in a practical, empirical sense, because Verta there, by applying a low carb intervention, have 92%, I think, lowered their medication or went off,
Yeah.
and 60% were effectively in remission from diabetes. And those were large volumes of people. And they are all reporting as well the kind of the return of appetite control. So to get the people out of the spiral, I suppose if you want to blame people at all, you can't say they're lazy, because the human race did not suddenly get lazy 30 years ago. That's absurd.
Yeah.
You could blame them maybe for not knowing that the foods they were eating were going to put them in the spiral.
Yeah.
That's all you could blame them for.
Yeah.
Pretty much.
And it's hard to blame people who are being led astray by big authoritative bodies like government food guides and heart and stroke and diabetes associations and so on, who are telling everybody, keep eating all these refined carbohydrates, sugars, vegetable oils. How do you blame people for following the advice they're getting from authority, you know?
Yeah, my quote would be, there's always some blame, because blame is like that, but overwhelmingly, yeah, you would have to put the blame. If you believe, like in the financial crash in Ireland, 2008, it was obvious around 2000 onwards, things were crazy. Everyone was getting credit. The house prices were going up. It was insane. And when the crash happened, you had all the people coming out saying, well, the people are to blame. They got greedy.
Yes.
And to be honest, I'd be very quick to blame anyone and blame the people or whatever. Whatever I think is to blame, I'll bloody blame it. But one thing really pissed me off about that was all of our government officials were telling us there is no problem. This is the new economy in Euro. This is the way it is. You need to get on the ladder. All the top economists in Ireland were saying this is not a bubble. This is all good. And all the bankers, the experts in money, were climbing over their granny to get at people to give them money. So all the strata of experts in money were all saying go. But when it went bang, it was the non-expert consumer that was apparently to blame, because they were greedy. And I see that as very much a similar parallel to everyone gets obese and diabetic and it's their fault.
Yes.
But it's the exact same. It's analogous.
Well, it's their fault because they're lazy and gluttonous. They don't exercise enough and they eat too much. But in the model that I just described, that's because at a subconscious survival level, that's what their brain is telling them to do. And our conventional approach is get your sorry butt off the sofa and stop eating. And people can't do that. I mean, it takes a tremendous amount of willpower to override a survival signal that's telling you to do exactly the opposite, right? So people are with leptin dysfunction are going to have a very hard time following the conventional advice. And that's why it fails. It's not addressing the actual problem.
The root cause of the problem.
It's treating people as though it's a problem of lack of willpower, a lack of character, that somehow it's your fault because you can't do what I'm telling you to do.
Yeah, and
And
in fairness, there are some really lazy people. I don't make no mistake about it. There
I am
are.
one of them.
Okay. Sometimes I am too. But no, there are a lot of people who know that Coca-Cola, etc., is bad.
Yeah.
And they know that eating kind of
Hmm.
chips and all day is bad, and they do it and they don't care. But that is one set of people. There's a huge amount of people who would love to be leaner, who are absolutely catastrophically affected by being overweight,
Hmm.
and would do anything, and they try and exercise, they go on treadmills and they fail and they fail, and it's
Hmm.
those people that are just trapped by the hormonal milieu and the control systems.
Well, you get very discouraged when it seems hopeless. You're told this is what you have to do, and you try it, and nothing happens. Nothing good happens. You try some exercise, and oh man, you just feel terrible, and you didn't lose a pound. You get discouraged, and you give up. You drink that Coke because what difference does it make, right?
Yeah, there's
And
certainly a group that, yeah, that just say I've tried and it's BS, I can't do it.
and the flip side is when you put them on a ketogenic or a low carb, high fat type of diet, you get such a sudden positive feedback. I mean, you shed weight quickly. A lot of people talk about clarity of thought. The fog clears, energy goes back up. People get a very rapid positive feedback, as opposed to the other where you struggle and struggle and it's very difficult, and you don't necessarily make much progress. Yeah.
And just to be a devil's advocate on that one, I had friends way back in 2012 when I independently discovered all of this. I went low carb based on the science. I didn't know there was such a movement out there.
Mm-hmm.
And I had fantastic results, but I knew exactly what I was doing and exactly what I saw from the research would happen, did happen. So I
Mm-hmm.
was hugely motivated. So I had the advantage of motivation.
Mm-hmm.
Friends all then followed me. They saw what happened, and they had very dramatic results too, because they knew I'd be right on this kind of stuff. Uh, but then around 6 or 8 months later, they began to slip and put weight
Mm-hmm.
back on.
Mm-hmm.
One of them was very candid with me. He basically said, Ivor, it's the bread. It's
Yeah.
the effing bread.
Yeah.
And the thing was, in the evenings, he'd go and do a bit of running and stuff, and pasta and bread, he just loved it. And he
Mm-hmm.
would dip in.
Yeah.
And as he began to dip in and cheat, it got worse and worse.
Yeah.
And before he knew it, within a couple of months,
Mm-hmm.
the weight had gone back on again.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's a case where you could say, well, okay, he knew. He knew what the solution
Mm-hmm.
was, and he knew where failure lay.
Yes.
And he did go there.
Mm-hmm. Yep. No, there's
So there
definitely
are some.
there are people like that, and I do in my clinical practice about 50% of my times with addiction medicine, and I think there are addiction pathways here.
Mm.
Bread is a particularly bad one, sugar, also refined carbs in general. I think there are addiction issues. And people that the story you just told is a classic addiction, remission, relapse kind of a situation, right?
Yeah,
And
with not so serious consequences, particularly, but still the same kind of
yeah,
phenomenon.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I remember there was a physician colleague I had who would treat, he said about 25% of the people that were trying to lose weight and improve themselves metabolically, he said about 25% of them have dopamine 2 receptor deficiencies. And these are the people that use stimulants like smoke cigarettes, drink a lot of caffeine, and self medicate with sugary foods and so on to overcome that deficiency of dopamine 2 receptors. He said he got good results by giving them nicotine patches, Wellbutrin, medications that address that particular pathway as they tried to correct themselves with diet and lifestyle changes, which is interesting because I think there is a subset of people where the addiction is related to neurotransmitters and the classic addiction model. Mhm.
Yeah. And interestingly, they may have a similar compulsion towards sugar and fat mixed foods because that
Yes.
can be very
Mhm. Yeah.
palatable, and
Yeah.
there is a place for palatability or hyper palatability
Hmm.
here
Yeah.
too,
Hmm.
a certain amount. But people don't usually have a compulsion to eat fat. They certainly favor it. It's an ancestral food,
Yeah.
but generally not to overconsume. I mean, a
Yes.
bag of potato chips with vegetable oil and refined carb, you can just keep eating
Yes.
until
Hmm.
it's
Hmm.
disgusting.
Hmm.
But if you got eggs, fatty foods with protein, and you ate some eggs, even if you love eggs, after a few eggs, you're going to tail off.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
that's another part of it
Yeah. Hmm.
too.
Hmm. I
Yeah.
think sugar is particularly offensive for that reason. Yeah.
It is debated as to, for say, someone who's diabetic, is
Hmm.
starch or refined starch as
Hmm.
bad as sugar or worse? But in terms of the compulsion, I think
Yeah.
when mixed with the
Hmm.
right type of foods,
Hmm.
it makes things, yeah.
We're talking about, the way I look at this is self-medicating with food, right? And certain foods you self-medicate with, the sugary ones primarily, but pastas and bread as well, the refined starches.
They are, and you
Hmm.
know what, Jade? It just occurs to me. I look. Everyone cheats occasionally, and I try and keep it rare because
Hmm.
I know, and from the anecdote about my friends, I know where it'll lead to.
Hmm.
If you start cheating anyway
Yeah.
regularly,
Hmm.
you'll drift,
Yep.
and then you need a reset, like
Hmm.
cigarettes.
Hmm.
So make it rare. But it did occur to me that this cheating, it can be quite compelling when you get it in your head that you're going to just take this hyper palatable dessert type food and you
Hmm.
know it's too sugary, but you're
Hmm.
going to do it.
Hmm.
It can play on your mind as you're thinking about that decision, like an ex-smoker
Yeah.
toying with taking a
Hmm.
cigarette.
Hmm.
And I just like the way you put that. There's that whole addiction element, and I
Hmm.
hear it a lot from people too.
Hmm.
But I just miss them. I love them. I
Yes.
think of
Yeah.
them.
Yeah.
So there's that as well, yeah.
Hmm.
I wonder, your talk Undoing Atkins,
Hmm.
I particularly enjoyed a couple of years
Oh,
back.
yes. Yeah.
And I just like to say first, this is a no conspiracy theory zone. This is my manner here, and I got 3,000 papers I've analyzed. It's science only, so no conspiracy stuff, right?
Yeah.
But that talk of yours brought in conspiracy theory and
Hmm.
articulated it as not really conspiracy, but as in just business imperatives,
Yes.
which is the way I like to see it. I'm a
Hmm.
corporate guy.
Hmm.
There is a conspiracy against low carb,
Hmm.
and now against low carb and keto, we're seeing major pushback.
Yes.
Um, but it's an auto response of industry and professional pride organizations and researchers and everyone who has put all their stock in low fat diets for 50 years now being majorly threatened.
Hmm.
So maybe some of the key points from that talk, Undoing Atkins, it'd be
Yeah.
good to go through.
Yeah. Well, businesses are in the business of making money. So, regardless of what their product is and what the potential harm is in pushing their product into the general population, they are duty bound to their shareholders to make a profit, right? So there's an amorality about business. The producers of cereals, for instance, don't have any mandate to worry about your health if you eat their product. Their only mandate is to sell enough product to make profits for their shareholders. So you have a recent phenomenon in Australia where the breakfast cereal manufacturers of Australia had developed this hugely thought out strategy on how to recover market share because breakfast cereal sales are going down. And it involved all kinds of interventions, none of which were upfront. It was about influencers, getting people that would be spokespersons, credible spokespersons that would promote their products and all these different angles on how to promote their product to the general population. A product that I think is harmful, right? Um, I, you know, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I find it fascinating how business operates. And the model, I mean, that we're most familiar with is the tobacco industry. When their product was threatened, we can look back historically now and see all the things they did to try and defend their product and their profits. Things like not terribly credible scientists that were put up front to speak on their behalf. Things that were done purposely to confuse the public about the emerging science showing the harm of their product. All these kinds of things still go on. I think that the businesses are actually getting better at it. I think that as time goes by, the expertise is improving in terms of how you influence general population. And I've always said that our best bet right now in advancing this is through social media. But social media is a playground for these people. I mean, all the stuff that's coming out about what's happened with elections and tampering and all that kind of stuff using social media, those techniques are being used by vested interests to defend their products. So I think we're in an environment where you have to be extremely vigilant. And recently we had these ridiculous studies saying that eating low carb increases your risk of mortality. Rubbish studies. I mean, horribly flawed studies. The one that I'm thinking about was published in the Lancet, right? A prominent journal, which published the Pure study a few months earlier. The Pure study showed basically the complete opposite, that eating higher carbs increased your risk of mortality. This study said eating lower carbs increased your risk of mortality in the same journal, a few months apart. This most recent study got headlines all around the world within a day. It reminds me of, I think, Mark Twain's old saying, a lie travels halfway around the world before the truth gets out of bed. Yeah. And I think it's true here because of the vested interests who grasp on anything that helps them defend their products and promotes it like the heck out of it all around the world. So that's the kind of environment we're in, where they'll use, I mean, in my lecture on undoing Atkins, the comparisons I made was the way American public opinion was shifted to support the first Gulf War, and how behind the scenes PR companies manipulated public opinion, and that those same companies are hired guns for anybody who wants to change public opinion on any topic, and that they do actually have sections in their business environment that specialize in food, changing public opinion about foods. So there's all these guns for hire out there, brilliant minds working for the benefit of the profit of food industry, different companies, not for the benefit of people that consume those products. So it's a fascinating world when you get into it, and you do feel like you need to put your tinfoil hat on, because it at times makes you think I'm crazy that somebody would do this, but it's a real phenomenon, and it's a dangerous one, because it's not about your health or your welfare. It's about the profits of somebody selling a product. Cigarettes, we're all done with that. We understand that. But the population doesn't understand that this is true about refined carbohydrates, the sugar industry, the manufacturers of tanker carfuls of vegetable oil, which is a recent phenomenon in the human diet. All these things that are harming us are being promoted as though they're healthy.
And of course, all of those excellent consultants and PR people and incredibly talented people that are used, there's basically war chests with tons of cash to pay for them. And it's also legitimate. It's not actually breaking the law.
Yeah.
And that's important people realize. You don't have to break the law to achieve enormous effects in propaganda.
Yeah.
It's a legitimate either business intelligence or competitive intelligence department we used to have, and it's all legitimate work to improve your market, improve your sales, and change public perception in order to achieve that. But the public, Joe Public, doesn't realize to what extent it's organized business activity.
Yes.
Yeah.
There are other aspects of this that are interesting too. There's the vegan, agenda. Okay, no harm to animals. There's the save the planet agenda. If everybody ate plants, we could save the world. So you get these mixture of agenda. It's not necessarily about health. And the troublesome thing about this is that right now in the Canada Food Guide, we're getting these initial sort of ideas of what's going to come out in the food guide. They're talking about plant-based diet, eating less meat because of the environmental impact. Okay, so it's no longer just about your health. It's about the health of the planet. And I think we're going, when you start to mix agendas, you're going to get into trouble. And I personally, I look very carefully at these ideas about, saving the planet. Does it make sense for people to go on a vegan diet to save the planet? And I don't find any convincing evidence to that effect. But even if there was, does that mean you should personally sacrifice your health? Let's say a plant-based vegan diet would actually be better for the planet if everybody in the world observed that diet, but that it's actually bad for your health. Would you make that choice? Would you say, I'm going to put my health at risk to try and be that drop in the ocean of influencing something much bigger? My personal feeling is no. I think we're heading, globally, I think we're heading for a calamity because I think we've overgrown our population based on the Green Revolution and petrochemical inputs into agriculture and food distribution, things that are not sustainable. So that we've overgrown the world population beyond the natural carrying capacity of the world. And that, like you're familiar with Malthusian ideas where yeast grows until it consumes all its food and then dies. I personally don't think we're smarter than yeast. I think this is what we're doing to the planet. And when the big cataclysm happens, I want to be in peak fitness. I want to have my health optimized at that point in time. So there's all these other mixed agenda that often are hidden. For instance, in Australia, big cereal manufacturer is Sanatorium. That's owned by Seventh-day Adventist Church, which has a religious belief that people should be vegetarian. And the first schools of nutritional science were established by the American Seventh-day Adventist Church. Kellogg, of the Kellogg Cornflake Company, was raised in the home of the woman who had visions that people should be vegetarian, one of the founders of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. So you have people that, and there's been work done in this area where science that was done by Seventh-day Adventist institutions, like the University in Loma Linda, will find in favor of plant-based options versus science that's done in other institutions on the same subject matter. There have been studies that compare these and find that. And the thing that troubles me there is that when you read a research paper, there are disclosure rules. Conflict of interest. You have to declare any potential conflict of interest. So if you're doing a study in nutrition, you have to declare if you've got stock in food companies, if you're getting paid by food companies, if you're a consultant to the food industry, and so on. But you don't have to declare if you're an ideological vegan or if you're a Seventh-day Adventist or any other religion that has a prohibition about diet. You don't have to make those declarations. So consequently, you have people that look like credible scientists pumping out research that consistently finds in favor of a certain type of diet without declaring that they have an ideological or a religious conflict of interest, which is, I think, a troublesome aspect of this, especially when you start to see these things merging into production of our food guide, for instance.
No, I'd agree. It is one of the problems out there, especially with epidemiological kind of almost pseudo junk science, associational studies. You can twist them with regression and statistics and whatever way you want to set them up to say whatever you want. Interestingly, though, the point you raise about ideological bias, the irony is that convincing someone that an ideological bias is as bad as a financial one, when the reality is it generally in human history is much, much worse.
Yeah.
So ideological bias from, and again, no problem with vegans
Hmm.
or anything, but anyone who has a powerful ideological bent which drives their whole life, they will do a lot more to fulfill that ideological belief than someone who's just getting a bit of backhander or financial benefit. So it's even more powerful in many people.
You know, if someone makes an informed decision that they're going to avoid animal food, source foods, out of concern for animals, I have no problem with that. I respect people that make those kinds of sacrifices. Where I have a problem is when they start to try and convince me that it's the healthiest way to eat, because I think the evidence is certainly not supportive of that. But the nature of nutritional science, there's so much poor evidence out there that you can find confirmation bias, tons of it, to support virtually any kind of an extreme position. And that's the problem we face. I'm on doctor, Facebook groups and things, and I get challenged by people who clearly have confirmation bias. They put up a storm of poor studies, mouse studies, epidemiological studies with hazard ratios of 1.2, stuff like that, to suggest that they've got a convincing case for a certain type of diet, when in fact it's all a bunch of rubbish. And it's just, the problem with nutritional science is that everybody knows that observational data is not to be used to infer causality, that it should generate a hypothesis, which is then tested with a randomized controlled trial. But the business of doing randomized controlled trial in nutrition is so exceedingly difficult and costly, virtually almost impossible to do, that we leap over that important step and make dietary recommendations based on data that we know is not supposed to generate a causality.
Yeah.
And that's why we get it wrong. That's why we get it wrong all the time. And that's why the public throws up their arms and says, one day it's good for me and the next day it's bad for me. I don't know who to believe, so I'm just going to eat whatever the heck I want.
Yeah, which again will put some blame nicely back on the person rather than the authorities.
And it plays into the corporate agendas and so on to keep that uncertainty and that confusion going so that people will eat the crappy foods that they shouldn't be eating.
They will actually drift, and
Hmm.
if you get a huge population and you confuse them to the point that they think it's all woo,
Yeah.
they will naturally drift down into that spiral.
Yeah.
Not all of them. Some of them
Hmm.
will still say, hold on, I
Hmm.
suspect that food's really
Hmm.
bad and this vegetable oil may not be good, or
Hmm.
I've read it on the
Hmm.
internet.
Hmm.
But as a population,
Hmm.
the drift will continue
Yeah.
into the toilet.
Hmm.
And the thing though you mentioned there, the hazard ratios. I mean, just for anyone listening, a hazard ratio up around 2, like 2x, twice as likely to get the disease,
Hmm.
is the kind of baseline expectation to begin the process of thinking there may be a causal link
Yeah.
here, because it's a strong, and if
Hmm.
it's dose response, so if you eat 5 times as much of the supposed bad food,
Hmm.
you get 5 times as much of the
Yeah.
diabetes
Yeah.
or something like that.
Hmm.
And there's these Bradford Hill criteria, and there are
Hmm.
more of them.
Hmm.
But like you say, all of that has been dumped
Yes.
completely.
Hmm.
So if you're 18% more likely by association, the World Health Organization can say that meat
Yeah.
is a carcinogen.
Well,
It,
the original, the observational study that got everybody going was about tobacco, right? Where the hazard ratio of certain type of lung cancer, if you smoked, was 20 times greater than if you didn't smoke. And Bradford Hill, that was the environment in which the criteria were developed. You had to have a significantly higher risk, plus a bunch of other factors, a dose response. The more you smoked, the higher your risk. Was there a physiological explanation? Yes, there was harm going on in the tissues of the lungs from the toxic content of the cigarette smoke. There are a whole bunch of criteria that have to be met. And as you say, it's all been washed away. And you've got institutions like Harvard, the School of Public Health and Nutrition, generating vast amounts of data with minuscule hazard ratios, like 1.2, 1.3, and then from there jumping into recommendations about diet. like the ridiculous study they did on low carb with plant protein versus animal protein. And the difference there was minuscule in hazard. But now everybody, the WHO, the food guide people are saying, yeah, get your protein from plants, not animals. And it just I'm sorry, it drives me crazy.
Yeah, it does. I'm almost inured to it now. I call them these published papers, and it's shocking how they're used. But
Yeah.
I've come to calling them toilet papers.
Yes.
But they are that without even just being crude or I mean, it takes me 3 minutes looking through like that recent low carb one, 3 minutes glancing through, and you can see that everything in the paper can be explained easily by healthy user bias or
Yes.
unhealthy user
Yes.
bias. And even I think Professor Feynman did some graphs showing the smoking rate and the sedentary behavior against the carbohydrate percentages, and it just lined up perfectly.
Yeah.
It's just worthless science, but like you say, industry likes it, the media like it. Everyone who's in the business of making money out of the modern food supply and all of the pharmaceuticals required to counteract its ill effects, everyone likes these stories. So I guess to finish off on the low carb side before moving on to another quick topic, the low carb movement now is growing rapidly. Diet Doctor has 50,000 paid subscribers. We're seeing a lot of trending. Keto is coming out as a majorly trending item. This time it looks like it's going to be hard to stop, notwithstanding what we just talked about, and there'll be more desperate measures, I'm sure. When do you think it'll be that low carb is broadly accepted as the obvious intervention when you acknowledge that the majority of your adult population is essentially diabetic, or at least has insulin resistance syndrome?
Well, if you look at the cost to the healthcare system and the economy in general, somewhere, sometime, the buck has to stop. You know, Vinny and I used to have these discussions. He thought because in Canada we have a government-run healthcare system that we should be able to make a significant change because the government would want to save money. The problem is you can't find the place where the buck stops in our government-run system. I always said to him, I think you've got a better chance in the States where you've got the business of healthcare, and there's going to be a CEO of a health maintenance organization who's going to want to save money, and that's where you're going to make some changes. And sure enough, that's where Verta is working now. They're lining up these health maintenance organizations saying, here, we can show you that if you pay us a certain fee a month for your diabetics, we can save you all this money in drug costs and other related costs. So I think at some point when the population gets sick enough that the economy itself, and in particular the health systems in the economy, are threatened with collapse, somebody's going to have to pull the pin and say, okay, we have to reverse course here and use an approach that actually works without breaking the bank. And that's obviously low carb keto.
Yeah, it's a no-brainer.
Mm-hmm.
And there is that kind of tipping point, if you will,
Yes.
that you described, a financial cost to the government coffers
Yeah.
tipping point.
Mm-hmm.
There might also be, I reckon anyway, maybe I'm living in hope and dying in despair, but I think when the medical profession get converted, maybe 5-10%
Yeah.
of doctors actually get this. And even in Ireland, we have a budding organization of only around 15 doctors, but there's quite a few younger ones turning up who are getting this and who see the absurdity.
Yes.
If they infect the body politic of medicine, that's going to be very hard to control for the forces that push back.
In Canada, there's one Facebook group I'm aware of that has over 3,000 Canadian doctors in it, based on their experience with low carb and their use of their low carb in their clinical practice. So that is starting to happen. I got invited to do grand rounds in a small hospital near Vancouver, and the doctors were already doing low carb themselves and using it with their patients. So I think there is a bit of a groundswell in the medical community. I think it's slower to come in, nutritional science and nutrition dietitians organizations and so on. So I am somewhat hopeful that there is a bit of a shift starting there. It's funny. I used to, I had a friend, a colleague, I'm on the faculty at the university, and I had a colleague that would invite me every year to give a lecture in the medical school. It was a course that all the students had to take. It was a doctor-patient society, sort of a mixed bag. And I would come and give my low-carb lecture every year, and it grew in popularity. And the theater would be full of not only the students, but some faculty and other disciplines. And the school has in different satellite schools in different cities in British Columbia connected in through video. So I would give this lecture once a year, and he was very keen, on this. He'd used it himself, and he found it quite helpful. So he was able to defend me being, putting this out there contrary to all the conventional thinking. And his approach was it was important to teach doctors critical thinking, to hear opposite views on things. So he managed to carry the day. Then he retired, and my invitation vanished. I was no longer invited to come back because the new director took over, couldn't push back against the people that were complaining about what I was doing. So fast forward a few years, and I was in a little discussion with a group of doctors. We started up this thing in Vancouver at UBC called the Institute of Personalized Therapeutic Nutrition. And this young doctor who was doing low carb keto in her practice said, "Yeah, I heard about it in a lecture when I was in med school." She didn't realize it was me that had given the lecture. But I feel like Johnny Appleseed, that story of casting the seeds out, and I don't know what germinates and grows and what doesn't, but I'm always out there casting the seeds out.
Excellent.
Hoping.
You're spreading your seed, at least in one fashion. Well, yeah, but I mean, with the growing movement and the tipping point of converting medical professionals, there may hopefully be like the intergenerational acceleration effect of the bad foods we talked about earlier, that hopefully we can get that happening with the medical professionals, and maybe they can even start switching over to dietitians. Doctors are hugely respected in society. It's incredible in Ireland. It's almost surreal. Consultants, particularly your senior doctors, if they start, coming out with this and explaining some of the technical background, the dietitians are going to be very wary of trying to push a dogma against them.
Yeah.
So anyway, listen, you could talk all day about that, but I'm really interested in seeing how it pans out. So one thing just occurred to me as you were talking, that you mentioned smoking earlier, and the smoking was the 20x. I think it's only actually around 2x or 2.5 hazard ratio for cardiac disease and all-cause mortality. But interestingly, there's a study with calcification, and the smokers with a low score had around a 2% chance of death in the following 7 years. And the non-smokers had a 1% chance of overall death.
Yeah.
But the non-smokers from the same population who had a high score had a 13% chance. So it was 6.5 times worse to have a high score as a non-smoker than to have a low score as a smoker.
Yeah.
So I suppose just taking this Bradford Hill, and I know it's a diagnostic and not a risk factor, but it just shows the power of prediction that's inherent in it. And it just brings me on to one other thing. Middle-aged, middle-risk people are where most heart attacks are occurring, and all of the tragedies of people in their mid-50s with children and young children, and you've got people who are apparently not obese, they're not overweight, they don't smoke, and they drop dead of a heart attack. Now, and I know, in the vast majority of cases, certainly if they got a scan, they would have had a high score, but that's it. We're working on it, but that's not so available yet. But I mean, the kinds of blood tests that they would have had, if looked at properly, could have also helped a lot.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the biggest tragedies, is millions of people dying of heart attacks unnecessarily. Let's say you have a middle-aged person whose bloods are not good. Besides low carb, which is an obvious first step because most people who are heading for heart attack, we know from
Hmm.
the Euroaspire and other studies, the majority of them are already diabetic, the people with cardiovascular disease. Besides low carb, what are the other things that you would advise for optimal health or recovery from metabolic disease?
I think strength training is probably high on the list. I mean, I'm convinced that you have to make dietary change the number one intervention. But I think after that, strength training, bit of cardio, and you know, drinking, smoking, the obvious things. Um, Sleep is an important factor. I'm an advocate of avoiding blue light in the evening. I think there's some merit in the science there that we're not meant to be exposed to all this blue light. That getting good quality sleep is a very important thing in terms of your metabolic health. And it's a bit of a chicken and egg thing because one of the things I did find when I went low carb is that my sleep improved. And then I'm trying to enhance that by I wear blue blockers if I watch TV in the evening, for instance. I make my kids wear blue blockers.
Well, my wife, yeah, is big for that kind of thing, and I agree with it in principle. It makes
Hmm.
sense.
Hmm.
I'm probably not good for making the effort.
Yeah, I know. It's one of those things. It's kind of fine tuning, but I think these things are cumulative. I think you try and do all the things if you can. Yeah.
So, are we saying then before we wrap up that the high-powered LED lights we've got all around us here in the studio are probably not ideal for your jet lag body?
It's keeping me awake.
Well, you've been fantastic, Jay. So, if nothing else, even if your health suffers, it's been worth it for just for these few hours.
Well, it's been a pleasure. It's been a pleasure because we've bumped into each other here and there, and we've been friends with you and your family on Facebook. But it's the first time I've actually had a really good conversation with you, and it's the first time I've got to meet your family in person. And what a lovely family you have.
Thank you, and yourself too, because we had your wife last year here for a visit.
That's right. And she's forever endeared to your young son who thought she was Alex's wife.
Yeah, and for anyone, for your son's wife,
Yeah.
yeah, that he was 9 year old. Well, I can't smell now. Actually, I think the kids have or the children have lit the barbecue,
Hmm.
so I can smell coals burning outside in spite of the bad Irish weather. I have got a stack of Irish 30-day aged ribeyes, only the best for you, and I think we should go and enjoy those.
I'm in favor of that.
Thanks a lot, Jay.
Thank you.